Okay. Yeah, so we're recording. So yeah, so this idea of fear, it's it's so targeted and it's so purposeful, right? You don't get people to listen unless you scare them, oftentimes, right? I mean, and you can't force people to do stuff until you scare them a little bit too. And so there's this whole injected nature of fear into our culture at this point, globally, really, not just ours, but I mean, and you see it in different ways and in different states and different countries. And when you look at it, depending on the governors and the mayors and so forth, depending on how relaxed people are in their states or cities or so forth, it gives you a real sense of, I think, of the nature of the communities that you're living in. Like in my community here, people are freaking out. Like I think I mentioned this last time. Like those. I know in New York City, Blasio's like that number to call to report people who were not social distancing and so forth. I mean, I think that number got shot down because millions of people were like flooding that number with like, unfortunately, not so nice messages and some graphic pictures. So I think they actually took that site down. But it's interesting to think how that kind of culture of fear can be contagious, right? That is more contagious, I think, than the COVID-19, right? And because it doesn't require any contact, right? You don't have to be near someone. You can just be on the computer, you can be on the radio, you can be on a telephone call, you can be wherever you are. And that fear is kind of like shooting straight at you through the television set, right? Or whatever medium you're using. And so it's way more insidious and it's way more problematic, right? And if you look at, the way people are handling that fear is, you have people who are fearing the illness, and then you have people who are fearing for themselves because they don't know how they're going to eat tomorrow and feed their families. And then you have there was some statistics where in some cities or states where the number of suicides was greater than the number of COVID-19 deaths. And that's really, really scary, right? That's problematic because none of that gets factored into, the narrative of what is going on because it doesn't serve the same way, right? So I think we have to be very mindful of that as we move into this process and as we start to really figure out how to navigate through which information to kind of like hold our, to hang our hat on, and which to like say, well, there's purpose here. There's something else behind the surface. Because I think there's no reason to inject that kind of level of fear into a society, knowing all the ramifications of what fear can do, if it's just the avoidance of getting sick. Right? There's something way more insidious to me than that. And I think it's something that doesn't leave, and for people who, when this ends, if it ends, right, that lingers way longer. It lingers way longer than any infectious process would linger, right? I mean, it is truly a latent pathogen at that point that will just kind of start to eat away and subsume the constitutional level, So that's a problem. But anyway, I think, I don't want to spend time talking about like physical trauma so much today because I don't, I think the emotional stuff is really where we want to spend our time, because I think these are the patients we're going to see. We're going to see them on telemedicine too, right? We're going to see them as we get into conversations with our friends, our family members, and our patients online. So like, what do you do when you're looking at someone who's telling you on a telemedicine, on a Zoom call, that, they're navigating this and they're scared and they're having some anxiety and so forth? What do you do to determine, because you can't feel their pulse at that point, right? I have had people, I do tell people to feel their wrist or their neck and to count their rate, because I want to see the rate, at least because that gives me a lot of information, the rate and the rhythm, right? So if there's any kind of speeding up and slowing down on the pulse or any skip beats, those are signs that the person's had experienced some type of trauma. Usually, I don't expect them to be able to perceive the rough vibration on the pulse, which is really our main pathognomonic finding, but the elevated rate will also tell me if they're experiencing some current trauma or relapse of past trauma. right? So, because generally the nature of trauma is that you get that shock and the body recoils, and then the heart kind of sends all its yin and blood into the interior to protect the organs, but yang is left unprotected, and the adrenaline surge creates that increase in heart rate, right? And so you get a heart rate that becomes bounding, right? So usually, depending on the level of the severity of the trauma and the intensity of it and the person's constitution, so you may see that heart rate go up 100, 120 beats per minute. You may see it go 90 or even into the 80s, depending on, you know, how robust and what kind of defensive mechanisms and adaptations the person has at their disposal. But if you're across from someone and they tell you that their pulse is 90 beats per minute and they don't have an infectious process, then they've had some type of trauma take place, right? We can probably be pretty certain that they're in the throes of something, unless they're like in the middle of an anxiety attack. But even then, might be suggested that they've had some type of trauma in their past to make them susceptible to this type of acute experience. So we always want to get that rate. We want to get the rhythm. We want to ask them if their pulse is, you know, at a nice even cadence as they're feeling it, because if they're having this kind of rough cadence where the beats are kind of speeding up and slowing down. I don't know if you can hear this, but I can kind of, you know, tap on something. So normally the pulse should be nice and rhythmic, but if they're kind of doing this, right, then they have what we call a changing rate at rest pulse in the Shen-Hammer system, and that's a sign of instability in the heart, right? That's a heart qi deficiency. And if they have that consistently, you know, then of course it's a more significant problem than if it's kind of a transient finding. But if they have that, and or even more significantly, if they have an interrupted or an intermittent pulse, meaning that they're dropping beats either regularly or irregularly, we can get into, you know, which is more significant and so forth, but all that's in the book. But that's suggestive that they have had some type of trauma in their past, which usually to get a rhythm issue like that person has had a trauma typically before the age of maturity. So for boys, you know, before the age of 16 and maybe even a little earlier for girls. And so we can see that a pre-existing trauma makes someone, of course, vulnerable unless it was properly addressed, and usually it's not, especially if they still have the irregular beat, that they're now more vulnerable to further traumas. And those traumas that come in the future then, because there's a vulnerability, means that they probably have a lower threshold also. So something that may or may not be traumatic to me or you or someone who's never had a trauma may rise to that level in this person and now go to a heart shock scenario where their heart rate's now in the 90s and stays there chronically for a while because their body's not able to adapt, right? So that's a question that I would always encourage you to ask someone on telemedicine consultation, because you get a lot of information from the rate and rhythm in and of itself. And so in the book, I have tables and charts that discuss the rates according to age ranges, right? So that Dr. Amber and Dr. Shen had listed. And you know, it's a very, it all makes so much sense, right? So when the baby is in utero, right? The fetus is in utero, the heart rate can be 160, 170, 150, somewhere in that range. The baby's born and the heart rate's around 110 or whatever it is. And then the first few years of life, it's kind of like 90, upper 90s, and it lowers until we get into like the meat of our lives, right? From our adolescence up until our 60s or 70s, where our heart rate's somewhere in the, you know, low 70s, right? And then as we get older, it drops into the 60s and so forth. And so what that tells us is, you know, the nature of yang, especially heart yang, right? So when you're first created, where you have all the exuberance of yang that's creating all the, it's catalyzing all the different reactions and growth and development and stages of development, what you see is a high rate. And then of course, anything that you do in life requires financing from somewhere. And so the financing for the heart rate, of course, is going to start consuming heart qi the more you use it. And so the heart rate is going to start slowing down, right? And which is why, you know, having that conversation with certain athletes whose heart rates are in their low 50s and upper 40s and even low 40s, you know, can be very problematic. They think they're healthy because they look healthy and they can go run a marathon. But what they don't realize is the lag time right, of what's been happening. And then, some of the first things that we see with runners and marathoners and triathletes and things like that is that they start to have, some mood swings and arthritic joint pains and injuries and sleep disturbances and so forth, which is the first signs of the heart chi and or blood and other things being consumed depending on other constitutional factors, right? So when you're looking at the person who's undergone trauma, and that trauma is now causing their heart rate to elevate up into the 90s or above, it's problematic because we know what's coming. We know that that feature is, number one, the adrenaline is burning up the kidneys, right, and weakening kidney chi. And we know that the elevated heart rate is taxing and making the heart work harder and is going to weaken the heart chi, right? So it's so important to get that heart rate into target range as quickly as we can as part of the process. And, if you can imagine the person with anxiety that, I've never seen someone in an acute anxiety attack whose heart rate was not elevated, right? I mean, that's a common thing. And similarly, if someone's in an anxiety attack and you don't do something quickly to get them back down, then what you're doing is you're allowing that heart chi to be consumed, right? And not just heart chi, right? Because it does other things. So it's also tends to further exacerbate the disconnect between heart yin and yang. Because heart yin will start to get depleted too, especially as they get all worked up and they start sweating and so forth, right? So because sweat is really just the fluid of the blood, right, as the steaming of the blood. And so as we start to see that get depleted, we start to get into this point where they get weaker and weaker and weaker and go into this vicious cycle where it's harder to get them off their acute episodes, and they're going to get more and more of them over time, right? Does that make sense? So making sure you check, those features, right, even on a telemedicine, because they don't require much, right? It's not like you need skill to count the heart rate, right? Any child can do it. And anyone can perceive variations in cadence and rhythm, right? It's very simple to do. Maybe to understand the subtleties of degree in cadence, that's one thing, but just perceiving and knowing that it's there is significant. And then the heart rate itself is it is what it is, right? And then you could also, one of the things that we do at the end of an evaluation is we would feel their resting heart rate again, and then have them stand up and swing their arm 10 times as fast as they can. And then we count the rate again for 10 seconds and we multiply by 6, right? Have you guys heard of this strategy? So this is something that we do. It's unique to the Shen Hammer system. And what that does is, again, this is all in the book, so you can see it there, but I'll just explain it quickly, is that when you do this, you're looking at someone, the target is that their heart rate should increase roughly between 15 and 18 beats per minute. You're doing an activity, the heart needs to respond to that activity to get blood and oxygen to the tissues, right? But there's 3 things that can happen outside the norm. One is that the heart rate doesn't quite make it up into that range. So maybe it only jumps up 10 or 8 beats, or it can drop below the resting heart rate, right? So that is a sign, that's typically pretty dangerous. Usually that's a sign of overt Western medically defined heart disease. But basically they're at significant risk, right, for heart attacks and fainting and syncope and all those kinds of things, because their heart's just not responding to any activity, right? And on the other side of the coin, you could have someone whose heart rate goes above that 15 to 18 range, and the higher above the range, the more significant that is, right? So with the elevation of heart rate above the 15 to 18, what we're looking at is gradations of heart blood deficiency, right? So, which is not to say anything about iron, hemoglobin, anemia. We're looking at just really blood volume at this point and how many times the heart has to pump to get that same volume of blood through the system to support the activity that one is engaging in, right? So, for example, if someone's heart rate jumps up 25 beats, they're looking at like a mild to moderate heart blood deficiency. If they jump up 30 beats, we're in that squarely in that moderate plus range. 35, 40 beats, we're looking to that severe category of heart blood deficiency. And those people you'll know them because they tend to have all the symptoms that go along with it. They're the insomniacs. They're the ones with joint pain and arthritic problems. They're the ones who are stressed and anxious. They can't sleep. They have problems with their memory and so on and so forth. All the things that you expect from a severe blood deficiency. In the extreme, what you get are also things like depersonalization, right? And dissociations and things like that, right? Like the POTS syndrome people, right? The postural orthostatic hypotensive syndrome. No, I see a lot of that in like teenage girls who have this, like their heart rates like skyrocket up like 40, 50 beats. They stand up and they pass out, right? So this is that dynamic. But you see this in people with longstanding trauma, right? And my sense too, which I've seen for years now, is those people who have those diagnoses like POTS and so forth, they typically have a trauma that has initiated that disease process in and of itself, right? So typically things like history of concussions, some type of history of abuse or injuries, birth traumas, and of course vaccinations. That's like one of the Gardasil vaccination, the HPV shot is notorious for creating POTS syndrome and those types of things. So heart rate is like a really simple, easy thing to measure, but it gives you some of the most profound information because the heart is the emperor or the empress, right? And so anything that goes along and injures or damages the heart compromises the emperor and empress's ability to maintain any type of stability throughout the empire. So every single thing, every tissue, every organ, every structure requires the proper movement and circulation of heart blood moving through it, right? And so it's one of those real simple things that you can do, on yourself, on your patients, even again, remotely to check. Okay. Are there any questions about that?
Ross? Hi,
yeah,
Ross.
Who's talking?
It's Linda Danzig.
Okay, hi.
Hi. So you said there were 3 things, and you talked about the heart rate not getting high enough, so too low or too high. What is the third?
Dropping below. So there was 3. So it's not quite making it up into the 8 to 50, 12 to 15, 15 to 18 range, right?
Okay.
That's one thing. And then you have people who drop below the resting heart rate.
Oh, sorry.
So those are the ones with the overt Western medically defined heart disease, typically, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So those, those people are easy to spot. I mean, their heart rates typically are not robust in themselves generally.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, so how else would you look at determining just from a telemedicine screen whether or not someone is experiencing heart shock? Anybody?
Hi, this is Kai. I just joined. Maybe you guys talked about this already, but what about tongue?
Yeah. So what would you expect to see on the tongue?
I guess I'd be looking for like the red tip, potentially like overall, either like blood deficiency or blood stasis, like a, pale color, or that sort of like stasis, purplish color. Also like areas of stasis, like purple spots, or
yeah. So that's the realm of typically physical trauma with that, like the little ecchymosis, the little blister, right? Anything else?
I feel like I think of like really pointed tongues too, as sort of that like increased heat in the heart, sharpening the tip of the tongue.
Yeah. So I look at those tongues as a Jue-in tongue, right? So that's like a pericardium issue, right? So usually it's like the liver, which is the side, and the pericardium, so they're contracting all the way in to create like this very triangular pointed tip, right? And sometimes you even see like a little ball on the front of the tip. And sometimes you'll even get to the point where that little ball at the tip is kind of greasy, right? And that greasiness would be the phlegm misting the heart orifices, right? Yeah, but the other tongues, so they're all interesting, right? And they're all, and absolutely, these are things that correlate all the time to trauma, but they're not definitive of trauma, right? Because you can find other people who have pointed tongues, or people who have blood stasis, or so forth on their tongue, that you wouldn't necessarily say that it was trauma per se. But those are definitely things to look at and correlate and help build your picture. And again, on telemedicine, these are easy things to do and inspect, right? You can have them lift their tongue and see the veins underneath, and we can see, all the different aspects of the geography on the tongue. Yeah, for sure. Anybody else? Any other things that you guys typically look for?
Hi, Ross. This is Rachel Strass.
Hi.
Hi. I would look for the obvious. Are they feeling anxious? Are they having tightness in the chest? Are they feeling like they're getting lightheaded easily? These are signs of classic panic, shortness of breath.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I guess what I'm trying to distinguish is symptoms versus signs.
Okay.
Right? So the symptoms are all the things that they're going to be reporting based off of how they're feeling and what they're experiencing, right? But I'm trying to get to some of those things that you are going to look, just by looking and inspecting, and the visual inspection through a screen, that's going to clue you in. Or something you're going to say, well, open your mouth, stick your tongue out, or whatever it is. I want to look at this. What might you see that's going to be definitive for you of a trauma, right? Or move you down that path, or potentially change the way you would question or treat.
Okay, then how about their complexion?
Yeah, so tell me about that.
Well, I would think that if they're a lot more pale than what you're used to seeing, a person looking very pale might be a sign of blood deficiency.
Right. Yeah, pallor for sure. It can be blood deficiency and or Qi deficiency, oftentimes both. But the main thing that we're looking for on the complexion is a bluish green color, right? That is definitive, right? Because a lot of people can have the pallor without the trauma. But the blue-green color in the complexion is really one of the hallmarks of a visual inspection to say, yeah, this person has trauma. And it's really right on. So I can look at someone through a screen, or someone comes to my office, they don't have to start saying a word and they have trauma, right? Of course you can look at things like the way they carry themselves and confidence levels and all these different types of things, and gait, and there's lots of little subtle clues that make you think about it, but the complexion, it, right? So that's right. That happens very clearly. And so what happens is the facial color turns as blue-green, and it's often very prominent around the mouth, okay, and chin and mouth and around the whole area, especially if it happens early in life. And you could also see it around the temples, right? If it happens a little later in life. And oftentimes what you see is, if it's severe enough, like the entire face. And I tend to find it a lot, especially in kids. So you see the kids always have it around their mouth. They have it between the eyes. And oftentimes they have these like thick blue veins that you see on the bridge. It's kind of like between the bridge of the nose and the eye itself, right? And that's always a sign of trauma. And those are the kids who typically have colic and digestive weaknesses, because usually at that point the trauma has impacted the nervous system in the gut, and you start to see like the allergic responses and all the different types of colic and food. They tend to be really picky eaters and so forth, right? They get bloated and so forth easily. But one of the other places that you see it very commonly is the neck. Right, you can really see the color distinction for a lot of people on the neck. And Kyle, yeah, absolutely. When you see when it's very prominent, you'll see the entire head, and the forehead can become that blue-green color as well. Yeah. I'm sorry, Rachel, you were saying something else?
I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why we have the blue-green color around the mouth and the veins between the nose and the eye. I mean, is this, I mean, my mind is going in like 30 different possible directions with how that could, why that would be, what's the etiology there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know that I have a great answer for it. I mean, you can correlate it to, mappings on facial diagnosis, because the chin for sure is a major place that you see it. And, the associations to the water phase and the whole birthing scenario and the root core energetics, because that's really, what we're looking at here when we're talking about heart shock is we're not just talking about someone who's had some type of traumatic experiences. We're talking about specifically traumas that have risen to the level to create systemic instability. That's what heart shock is. That's the difference between heart shock and just trauma, right? So, or like major adverse reactions and experiences, right? So, and when we're talking about that, what means that someone has been shaken to their core, and that has created such a fright that it's impacted their blood flow and oxygenation and presence, right? So if that kind of creates that response, then you don't have the capacity to fully engage and move the blood and the spirit which resides in the blood and the oxygen which circulates in the blood in that same smooth, even manner, right? So why it happens just around the mouth as when you're young, I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that necessarily. I mean, those muscles are involved, like the ring muscles are involved in breastfeeding right away. They're the first that are engaged. It's the first vocalization of when the baby's born. These areas govern, like I said, a lot of water phase types of things, and as well as, of course, digestive system, energetics too. You get a lot of nervous system aspects around the eyes and the nose. We talk about that a lot when we get into the nervous system. I think I talked about that a lot last class a couple of weeks ago, in the nervous system and the eyes and the hypervigilance and the what Dr. Shen would call nervous system tense or nervous system weak. And one of the features of that is like these wrinkles that you get in the eyes from the person who's always like straining and struggling and kind of looking ahead, and so really like so hyper vigilantly focused on what's in front of them, right? Because they're always looking for a perceived threat that may be lurking, right? And so all of these things kind of tie into that same idea. And so as a reflection of nervous system functioning, and overall circulatory functioning, it's significant. And and the mouth is also the place where one of the main places that we bring in nourishment, right? But I would say we also bring that in, we get nourished more subtly through the eyes too, in terms of our visual capabilities and the subtle essences that we bring in from nature, and the things that we expose ourselves to, and the things that we look at, and through our ears and nose too, from all those different aspects of the more subtle chi that we imbibe and absorb into our systems daily, right?
Mm.
But that blue-green color, for if you have better reasons than that, I'm happy to hear them. But it almost like what you can be certain on, whether we have the full capacity to understand the semiotics of what that is. We know that for certain what it means, right? We know that if we see it, it's telling us something about shock and trauma and oxygenation and how that has left its imprint, right? And things too, when you see that, trauma does impact our ability to nourish ourselves from the point of trauma onwards, right? It alters perceptions. It alters the way that we, if what we do through our absorption of energy, whether it be eyes, ears, food, whatever, we're taking things that are external to us, and we are converting them into something useful for us, right? We take the subtleties of those essences, and then we kind of excrete the rest that we don't need, right? So, in so many ways, trauma impairs that, because it impairs the clarity and the perceptive capacities through every single portal, right? Whether it be mouth or eyes or ears or whatever. We hear things differently, we see things differently, we smell it and we taste it differently after a trauma than we did prior, right? And so that distortion, right, is also partly stasis, right, from things being locked up in the blood and being fixated in a particular way of seeing things now that didn't exist prior to a trauma, right? And so that really, I think, speaks a lot to all the different areas that we see as well with the blue-green color and the lack of oxygenation. We're no longer being nourished in the same way. All what we're really doing is strengthening the narrative of that trauma onwards, right? Unless we can do something to intervene. And one of the things that Dr. Hammer talked about was, he said, you can never take away someone's trauma, right? That's never what we're doing, because, and you wouldn't want to, right? Because trauma is partly a challenge that people need to overcome to get to next places. But he said, one of the things that you do is you dilute it, right, with additional experiences that are more nourishing, right, that are nourishing in a way that the trauma wasn't, or that nourishing in a way that the trauma impacted, right? So if, for example, you have this happy-go-lucky, gregarious teenage girl who, was friendly, open-hearted, and then, walking home from school one day late at night, she gets mugged and beaten. She's probably not going to be so trusting and gregarious and open-hearted from that point forward. And that's something that we see. I mean, maybe she is. Maybe she has a special quality where she's able to overcome that. But my experience with patients that I see is typically they become, that fire phase would become dampened, right, by fear and so forth, and they would be very reluctant. And so what would need to happen for that person, in addition to all the things that we do, would be to create some additional experiences for this person to dilute that, right? To be able to have experiences where they can be out with their friends and be gregarious and open-hearted and have that returned and be nourishing and so forth, where it kind of alleviates some of that, or kind of just takes that diluted experience or dilutes that experience to a point where it's not the overarching theme in their life anymore, right? And that is so much of what I talk about, in the book when I go through that hexagram, 51 thunder, right? So that idea of, at first, people shake and shiver and then they whoop it up with laughter, right? So they don't just whoop it up with laughter unless they're moving to the other side of trauma, right? You have to allow for the changes to kind of move through and not get stuck. If you get stuck in it, then you run the risk of altering your Ming, right? Your destiny. Right. And so what we're trying to do is to kind of reinitiate that healing process and get someone back on that track. And that's specifically what that hexagram is speaking to, and specifically with the nature of thunder, right? Which thunder is a very particular energetic, and it's, part of the Taoist lineage that I belong to, which is part of this thunder medicine, right, which talks a lot about this, the use of harnessing that and absorbing it, the writing of talismans, and so forth. So that's all part of it. Does anybody have questions on that part? I see Kyle had a question. Do we ever look for the color red for the heart as well? Yeah, we do. And so that gets me to this next place. So one of the other ways you can look at trauma is by comparing the hands and the face, right? And so if the face is redder than the hands are, it tends to be a scenario where the heart is affecting the circulation. So that tends to be people who've had emotional shock, right? So the heart is creating circulatory issues, and we're seeing the face being redder than the hands, right? So all the heat gets kind of trapped in here and it's not being sent out to the extremities, right? When the hands are redder and the face is more pale, typically it's the circulation affecting the heart, right? And typically the etiology for that tends to be more physical rather than emotional trauma. Does that make sense, Kyle?
Hey, Ross?
Yeah.
You can hear. I was about to ask if the source of red is different than the source of blue-green. And the last thing you said confused me a little bit. Maybe I just wasn't able to process it, but is red more emotional trauma versus physical trauma?
When the face is red and the hands aren't.
Yeah, but how, okay.
So that's emotional. When the hands are red, but the face is pale, that tends to be more physical.
Okay.
Right? So that's like chi and blood trapped in the periphery, right? Where the emotional shock is it's trapped more in, you know, in the core, right? In the upper part of the body.
Okay. Well, when it's blue-green, can that also be emotional?
Yes, both. That's emotional. That's a whole different finding.
Uh-huh.
So the blue-green coloring around the complexion is a sign of physical and or emotional trauma. And one of the things to always remember is that physical trauma always has an emotional correlate to it. It's hard to get into a crazy, dangerous car accident and almost die and not have the emotional trauma that goes along with that too, right? Mm-hmm. So they tend to go together for the most part. Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So.
May I ask a quick question?
Yeah. Who's that?
It's Linda.
Hi. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi there. Could you tell me, in your opinion, what is the difference between heart shock and trauma? I loved your definition of heart shock, but it sounds like there's some gradation there, that you have a delineation that you can make.
Yeah, I mean, something that's traumatic. I mean, you know, the word, I'm just distinguishing them because people say trauma a lot, right?
Right.
I mean, in essence, they're the same thing, but you could have a lot of severe emotional upsets, severe injuries that would not necessarily be traumatic, or, you know, it's really an issue of lexicon, right? I mean, you know, it's how you define it, but my distinction is that things can be traumatic that don't become unstable, right? The defining nature of heart shock is instability. It's not just deficiency or blood stasis or whatever, all the different disparate diagnoses that I go through ad nauseum in the book about. You know, it's a marker of instability. It's something that cannot rectify on its own. It creates chaos.
And so
has a sequela over time that tends to get worse and worse.
And so that's indelibly imprinted on the pulse, correct?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Right, and with very specific signatures.
Right, like I remember feeling the left middle pulse, the liver pulse at the blood level, and detecting a bifurcation. And that was very exciting to find, but pretty, you know, it was the most intense watching the life pass before your eyes experience for the patient.
Yeah, so that, you know, for those of you who aren't aware of what that is, so a split pulse is something we find not so often, but it shows up more than you'd think in the Shenheimer lineage, and it can be found, I mean, well, it's there, whether we, other systems just don't necessarily perceive it or know to look for it or know what to make of it when they perceive it. But basically the radial artery can bifurcate in certain positions. It can be over the entire wrist or both wrists or just in one position. You know, decade ago, maybe I would say, or even longer, it used to, I think the first ones that we what we found tended to be more so in the middle positions. In particular, the left middle tends to be probably the most prominent place it shows up. But since then, over the years, we found split pulses in pretty much every single pulse position you can think of. And the idea originally was that it was correlated heavily with people who had either near-death experiences or had particular obsessions or fears of death, or had death close to them, right? So caring for a loved one who was dying on their deathbed in hospice, or someone who had a traumatic car accident or whatever it was, and what they were, or someone who's really going through cancer or fearful of their own mortality. So we would see that a lot. You know, and I still think it bears out most of the time. Typically when I find it, people do have some type of obsession with death, not necessarily they've had an experience themselves. And there's all different degrees and gradations of it too. I felt like where it feels like two complete like arteries running side by side, or when you press into it, it tends to kind of bifurcate. So there's all different subtleties that go along there. And I think the middle is a place that we would see it more often, and in particular the liver, because if you think about what the liver is as the wood phase, and the one of the gestures or symbols of the wood phase would be like flexibility, or like bamboo, right? Kind of growing and moving, right? This idea of creating anastomoses, right? So it's like if some area gets blocked, you have the ability to navigate and move and create another pathway, right? And so, and also if you think about that position as the middle, reflecting some of the energetics of wood, and in particular gallbladder and Shaoyang, this idea of, am I here or am I here, right? I can't decide if it's this or that, right? So these kind of creating two vacillating pathways and roadways that we kind of navigate our lives on a psycho-emotional level, right? So, you know, that's just another, that's just kind of my take on some of that. But yeah, the split pulse is definitely something we see.
Hey, Ross?
Yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to move to something different. So if you had something on this topic.
Oh, yeah, I'm obviously I got in late, but what does a bifurcated pulse feel like? The first image that came to my head is something that's separated.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound like
that's what it is.
That's what
exactly
it is. There's a disconnect.
Yeah. There's like a space between. So when you're feeling the pulse, you feel this the artery and the radial impulse. And then as you roll your finger, you can find a space where there's nothing. And then you keep rolling over, and then there's a whole nother sensation and artery there. You feel like two separate tubes. Typically, one is the primary and the other one is the secondary, meaning that one tends to be much more robust and more wide and tense, and the other one tends to be thinner and tighter, you know?
So like if you're moving over from liver to gallbladder?
No, so those are different positions. That's different positions. I'm talking about like as you roll your hand, as you roll your finger. Remember when we're feeling the pulse, as we go down the depths, we tend to go a little bit more medial as we go deeper, right? So we kind of roll in on like this way, right? As we go deeper. And so as we're rolling medially, right, towards the tendon, you feel that there's actually another artery there, another separate, distinct, tubular artery. It
doesn't sound like something you pick up right away.
No, it's, you know, you would think it, oh my God, it's so obvious. There's two tubes running here, right? But it can be fairly subtle, and takes some someone showing you, you know, sometimes where it is, or you may just feel it and be like, does not know what to make of it, or think that you just kind of like caught the other side of it when it's really something different, you know? Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So one of the other things you can do, Kelly saying, have found it usually feels like a wishbone shape in the sun. It does feel in the sun. It does feel like that. Yeah. So that's one of the places. It's easier to feel in other positions along the trajectory of the radial artery because it's just so much more obvious, you know, in general. But yeah. So moving along this idea of what can we do in telemedicine, I thought it'd be fun to kind of just show you guys a little bit of the hand in terms of Chinese medical palmistry, because I think that's something you could easily have your, you know, patient, because actually they can stick out their tongue and you can see their complexion, and they can palpate their own wrist to get a heart rate and rhythm. You could also look at the palm too. And there's also the eyes, which we didn't really talk about yet, but we can talk about that if we have time after this. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see. Where are we? Whoop. Did that work? What are you guys seeing right now?
Heart shock signs, hand and palm diagnosis.
Is that all you see?
No, I just see, the window with the
Yeah,
PDF
cool.
files, yeah.
Okay, cool. So one of the things on the palm, and you could think of it like, you know, I talk about it in the book, right? This idea of, you know, all these different gestures, right? So your hands are how you handle things, right? And so it's a way of looking on particular, everything in Chinese medicine has a map, right? We use the map, right, to kind of understand and make sense of the terrain that we're trying to interpret. And so if we're looking at the hand itself, then what we find is that there are lines that we know of in palmistry that correlate to channels within the Chinese medicine framework, right? And so here, you guys see the palm? So it's a mapping and a correlation of the various lines and features to the 8 extraordinary meridians, and also a mapping of time, right? So we're looking at time and we're looking at energetics, and we're also looking at the 5 phases too, right? So thumb is water, then it moves around wood, fire, earth, and metal. Some of the different correspondences perhaps than you would think of in terms of just channel system, where you would think of the little finger as heart because the heart channel runs there, right? But this is a different mapping where the middle finger represents the fire phase. And then of course this gets, you know, really detailed in palmistry in terms of the shape of the fingers and the shape of the nails and all, and they all have different correspondences to sinew channels and divergent meridians and so on and so forth. But I wanted just to show you this one because I think it's an easy one to look at for people online. And you could also, before consult, even have someone snap a photo of their palm and send it to you and look at it even before the session to get some sense of what's going on. Because you could not just look at, you can diagnose a tremendous amount, not just heart shock, right? What I have in the book is really just going through some ideas on shock, and what you find in terms of seeing like little asterisks and stars and tic-tac-toe grids and so forth that reflect things like obstruction and traumas at certain parts of our lives, right? But if you look at these like dotted lines here, do you see my cursor too or no? Can you see my cursor?
No,
Yeah.
can't see your cursor.
I
Okay.
can see it. It's a little cross going up around.
Yeah, a little cross here.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you look at these little dotted lines that come down, so if you look at between the fire and wood fingers from the crease, and you bring that straight down to where the lifeline is, and the lifeline, we're going to call that the Chongmai, right, in terms of our Chinese medicine approach, then this is going to be the cycle, the third cycle of 7 and 8. Right, so that's how old the person's going to be at the time they reach this part of the lifeline, right, or the Chongmai. And so what we're looking for here, and then you can just, you know, take that same percentage and kind of map it all the way around the lifeline to get a sense of the length of this person's life and what's happening, based how to interpret signs and how to know when they're going to happen in someone's life or when they've happened. So looking at little grids and like I said, asterisks and symbols like dashes and spaces or breaks in the lines. These all have different meanings and interpretations in terms of, especially like on the heart line and the red line, So if we see those asterisks along the line, so the heart line goes from the pinky side all the way towards the index finger. So that's how we would map this going this way. And so if you drop down the line from the metal and earth finger, from the between point down to the heart line or the Renmai line, then we're going to see, again, that same third cycle of 7 and 8. So oftentimes in this area here, in this first little, before we get to that third cycle, this is typically for a lot of people where we'll find these asterisks or islands or other types of things that are manifestations of some experience of heart shock and trauma. Okay, we have the Weimai line that kind of runs up, which is part of the career line. We have the head line, which is the Dumai line. So, you know, it's just an interesting way. And I go into more detail, you know, in the book about that stuff. So you can kind of maybe correlate that and go back and forth. But just to get a sense of if you want to try that with patients or even your own, you know, yourself or family members before you do it on a telemedicine session, you know, because if you're, of course, if you're going to ask them to show you your palm, they're going to say, what'd you find? And if you don't feel comfortable looking at that, then maybe don't do it. But it's kind of a fun, it's a fun way to understand and just get someone involved in the process. And by the way, there's also, if you go on YouTube, you can find, oh my goodness, I've probably watched hundreds of Chinese medical palmistry on, well, there's palmistry, but once you learn the basics of Chinese medical palmistry, you can correlate all the other stuff and map it all in and make sense of it. So it's really interesting. One of my middle daughter, all her friends always want to come over and have me read their palms, you know, tell them when they're going to get married and how many kids they're going to have and all the different things going on. So it's kind of it's a fun pastime. But in any event, it's kind of a cool thing to do because it really does show a lot on the palm. And you know, when you get into also the different mounds of what each area represents, and you can see that the triple burner manifested in the palm. You can see hormonal cycles manifested in the palm. And as you look at it and looking at the plumpness and the color and the moisture of the palm, you can get a sense of whether or not this person's, you know, hormonal system has been depleted from the chronic nature of the stress or the traumas that they've been experiencing. And, you know, it's just a really interesting way to kind of approach it. So like the different kinds of bracelets that show up, like the ones that you saw on the wrist, like on the crease here as the Daimai reflection. So, you know, it's just kind of another fun little tool to add in. Okay. Let's see, let me stop the share. I think there's a few questions that are here. Favorites in terms of sites or palm reading, you mean? I know you just search, you'll see, you'll get it. Once you look at a few videos, you'll find the ones who are like basically, you know, foofy and the ones who actually really give you a lot of good information. But in terms of, does it matter which hand is dominant? You know, there's no one agreement on that, you know. So what I've heard is that some people say, oh, left for man and right for woman. From what I've heard taught was that it depends on your dominant hand, right? So your dominant hand is kind of what you've been, your dominant hand is what you've been given, and the other hand is what you make of it. So you can actually see the differences in the two hands. And so you can actually gauge how you're actually living and utilizing resources and so forth, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of fun. Okay. In terms of abdominal diagnosis, that's not really something you can look at so much from a telemedicine perspective, but there are things that you can do in terms of watching their breathing patterns, right? In terms of their chest, right? So you can watch how smoothly they're breathing in and out. It's always important to do. You know, you always do that when you're in person with someone, feeling their pulse. You know, in Shen Hammer, we're looking at rate in terms of a clock, but in classical pulse, we're gauging it on their breath, right? So how many beats per breath. And so it's always important to watch how deep and long those inhalations and exhalations are. They tend to be much shorter when someone's experienced trauma and have more shortness of breath and tightness in their chest, and more chest breathers tend to be people who've experienced trauma too, right? So, yeah. And let's see. Were there any questions on that? I know I'm not getting into a ton of information on that per se, because it's hard to do over the computer, but.
Ross, I think it might be worth, like, if I were to do some telemedicine, I would want to teach them how to palpate their abdomen. I'd be interested in hearing a little bit about your abdominal diagnosis.
It's not something I do a lot of. I mean, I do touch everyone's abdomen. I'm not doing any particular tradition like 5-element tradition or Japanese tradition necessarily, although I do know those correspondences and so forth. I'm looking, more so for texture, tightness, temperature, guardedness, right? Those types of things. So, I think you can, whatever is, I think most importantly to answer that kind of question would be, it's really more so about how you interpret those findings and teaching someone the way that's consistent with your diagnostics, because you're the one who's going to be diagnosing and treating based off of it. Does that make sense? And then,
Yes, thank you.
yeah. And then just the other part that you can look at in terms of telemedicine and consultations would be looking at the eyes, right? So, how people are seeing the world and the distorted nature of that, right? So, which is true for all of us, right? That's kind of by definition, at least from the Taoist perspective, that we're, we are approaching everything from this kind of post-heaven mindset of ego and preferences and predilections and so forth. So it's by virtue of that we are all distorted. And of course, there's different layers of that distortion and gradations and so forth, right? So the person who has phlegm misting the orifices after traumas and so forth is, potentially another layers in for that sort of thing, right? So, well, some of the things you can do is look at, you would need them to kind of show them how to do this, but to kind of peel back the lower lid of their eye and kind of fold it under so you can see the mucosal lining inside. And so you'd want to have them, kind of close, or have someone take a picture of that and then send it to you. Because what you're looking for is that you should see very discrete vertical red lines coming in the inner eyelid. Okay. And with physical trauma, oftentimes what you see is that there's a red horizontal line at the base of the eyelid on the same side that the trauma occurred on. There's also something that we find a lot with toxicity, which is that discrete verticality of red lines it lacks uniformity, right? And it becomes varying different colors, oftentimes brownish. And they start to kind of, bleed into each other a little bit, right? And so this can happen from trauma, of course, because during trauma, there's this, it impacts it creates an accumulation of waste products that aren't properly excreted, right? Because of the blood stasis, right? And so we may see a building up of that over time, especially in the liver. We can find those qualities. There's other pulse findings that correlate with that, choppy pulses, but also blood unclear findings according to the Schedhammer tradition. And then with emotional trauma, oftentimes we will see a confluence of those vertical lines too, with increasing redness, especially if there's more heat involved, right? So you might get excess heat or yin deficient heat or so forth, right? But even some of the most simple things, right, is you would see things like spaciness, right, confusion, right, a hollowness, right, that kind of like vapid kind of quality, that glassiness, right, that we might see when we see people with Shen disturbance, or like a very intense kind of glare, right, where they look like they're really kind of staring you down, right, or that traditional sanpaku, right, the three whites, right? Normally you only see the whites on the sides of the eyes, but sometimes you see the top or the bottom, right? So you see all three sides. So those are other signs of trauma. And that one, was classically correlated to someone who was going to have an early violent death. All right, so that's kind of interesting. Tracy saying she's seeing a lot of eyes with a mucosal lining between the capillaries is yellow. Yeah, I mean, that could definitely be some type of toxicity, liver, jaundice, damp heat, right, kinds of scenarios that show up. What population of people, is that like a COVID-19 thing you're saying? So what kind of population is that in? Just kind of anybody? Just random patients?
Yeah, sorry, I'll pause myself.
Oh,
yeah, I mean, it's mostly, I treat a lot of people with chronic autoimmune issues, but definitely the majority of them, I will say, have damp heat. They have terrible diets in addition, which is feeding their autoimmune issues.
Yeah. So I would expect it to be along those lines and impacting that the liver, probably more so even than the digestive system, but probably a combination of both. Yeah. Any other comments or questions? I mean, I just kind of started riffing here. I wasn't planning on teaching anything in particular. We started talking about telemedicine, so I figured I would go on that trajectory a little bit. So I hope that was useful in terms of like what things you can do and look for and spot in patients even during this time and into the future. So yeah, Linda, I mean, treatments are tricky, right? Because we haven't diagnosed anybody yet. And that really is, the essence of the entire part 2 of the book. Once we go into each channel system and get the signatures and the energetics of what those channel systems are all about, and whether patients are manifesting and experiencing the world or showing symptoms that tend to put one towards one channel system rather than the other. And of course, all the different herbal formulas that go along with the energetics of those channel systems as I've delineated there. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, in the future, we can probably talk more treatment as we get into more kind of, I don't know, systematic workings through the book, which I'm happy to do. Like I mentioned that last time, we can create something where we get a group of people and meet regularly and really go through the book kind of sequentially, because that could be great too. But yeah, I mean, if someone wants to bring a case study, that would be really cool. And yeah, Tracy, I mean, that's my goal, is try and start going through the book together, and where everyone would be, where I would say, okay, we're going to work on these chapters on this class, and then we'll kind of move through. And once we get to the channel systems, of course, we have to spend more than, each channel system is an entire weekend module. So it's like a 14-hour, class that I have set up through NCCAOM. So that would take the course of like a while to get through in this format where we're not spending the whole weekend together, but we're doing an hour and 15 or 20 at a time. So, but yeah, I think that's the way to go, is to kind of work our way through, so we're all at the same pace and moving through the same material, and then we're all asking the same questions and building on that information. Yeah, and if someone does want to bring particular cases, then I'm happy to kind of like work through these cases to show the thought process and the mechanisms and the methodologies that I use to go through it. And then, and if that resonates, then, it's something you can apply yourself. I mean, I don't ever want to pretend that the way I do it is the way to do it. It's just the way I do it. So, and if it's useful, then great. But, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. So, any other questions, or are we good for tonight? I'm happy to hang on longer if there's questions or topics that are burning for you.
Ross?
Yep.
Do you see do you see like community acupuncture as a place for what you're offering?
Yeah, I think there's any place. I think it depends on the nature of the relationship to the patient and the practitioner, because I don't think, well, clearly you're not going to start talking about some of your deepest traumas while you're sitting next to someone that you may not know. So I don't know exactly how everyone sets up their community clinics, how close proximity people are to each other, and how much privacy there is. Clearly, some of these things require intimacy, right, to really navigate in a way that is respectful to your patients and what they've been through and so forth. But again, it all relates to the comfort level of the practitioner and the patient and everyone else. So, I have patients of mine who, despite being in a private room across the hall from another patient, speak so loud, they don't care who hears them, right? So they don't feel that level of security. I mean, they have that level of security where it doesn't matter if someone else hears anything private, and other people who are going to whisper, and even if there's no one else in the office. So I think you have to be mindful of that sensitivity. But I don't think it's not relevant. I mean, if a patient is demonstrating signs and symptoms of trauma, and you are able to perceive those, then I think it should be addressed, right? I think you can speak to the patient about that, and you don't have to always go through like this ad nauseum, step-by-step storytelling of what they've experienced. Some patients don't like that. Some patients aren't comfortable with it. Some patients don't find it helpful. And that's one of the reasons too why you have options of different channel systems, right? So you can use something like the diversion channel for someone who's not really looking to get there on an emotional level, right? Or if they were, then you can think more about low vessels or primary channels to get to that level of emotion where they're willing to bring some of these things back up into their consciousness. But if they don't want to, if they're not ready, then you wouldn't want to do it. So again, it's really a privacy and a comfort issue. But the information, what you're gleaning, right? I've treated people for trauma who didn't need to tell me about their trauma, right? I had people swear that they haven't experienced trauma until I, started treating the trauma, because that's what I treat. It's not like you're if you're treating trauma, you're going against someone's wishes. Like if someone's coming into it for a treatment, and you see and diagnose and perceive particular things, and you're going to do a treatment based off of that. Like, you're not forcing someone to tell you anything or whatever, but you're just treating on a particular level, then that's what you do, right? I mean, it's not like someone coming in for shoulder pain, but they also have hip pain, and they don't tell you about their hip pain, but their hip pain gets better. They're not going to be complaining about it. They're not going to say, "Oh, how come you treated my hip pain?" It's like, it's just part of the overall holistic nature of what we do. So it's almost like you're treating the trauma, or impacting the trauma, or influencing the trauma, whether you know it or not, because it's there and it's part of who they are. And it's part of how they experience their world, right? So how can, once you become aware of it, it's like, and you start to see those different connections, it's almost like, you can't ignore it, right? It's like, it's part of who they are. It's like, things emerge from latency just because it's partly how someone is adapting to any particular treatment. Like, how many times have you treated someone for something completely not related to something else, and those other symptoms reemerged, right? And then you explain it, right? So, well, this is part of your body being ready, to move something that hasn't been moved, that's been stored away in latency for a period of time, right? I mean, if you treat someone as a primary channel or a sinew channel treatment, and they emerge with like a cold or something the next day, and they want to blame you, or it's like, no, you didn't cause their cold, but you perhaps moved something that was ready to leave, or initiated something out of latency. And that can be good or bad, right? So it's good that's why a lengthy evaluation, a pulse evaluation, where you get to see all those different layers, because it's one of the things where you don't just go into someone's divergent channel and start to do deep superficial clearing treatment because they have a common cold. I think that would be foolish. You don't know what you're bringing out, like you're opening up Pandora's box, right? So that would be perhaps irresponsible, right? And same time, you wouldn't go into the 8 extraordinary vessels and, treat a common cold, because why would you tap into the UN level to treat something on the Way level, right? So these are just things to think about and the appropriateness of the treatments. But in essence, when you're treating someone who is experienced or has experienced certain things, it's part of who they are in their makeup, and it's hardwired. So it's kind of hard not to impact it in some way. So your job is to figure out how to do that in the most responsible way, right? And also make sure that if you think that something may emerge out of latency, that's a conversation that happens to make sure the patient's okay with that, right? Because you don't want to bring traumas up for someone if they're not ready to handle them, right? Because that would be detrimental to their healing. Does that make sense? I don't know if that really was on topic for the community acupuncture, but it's the idea of like permission and the idea of understanding what you're treating and the sensitivity to the individual and the communication of what you're doing. Is just part of doctor-patient respect and part of that relationship. What does my shirt say? Oh, this is it says Miyazaki Times. It's a Japanese. It's an area where my wife's family's from in Japan when we were there over the springtime. It's funny because when Japanese people read it, they kind of laugh because it doesn't just say Miyazaki. It's kind of like a slang for like, Miyazaki Times, like, good times in Miyazaki. Yeah, Tracy, I will share the recording again for sure. That's not a problem. Yeah, and if we're interested in doing, like, I know there's a core group. I mean, last time we had a lot more people show up, and I know I gave a lot more notice about I wasn't sure if I was doing Tuesday or Thursday. It wasn't until yesterday that I kind of just said I kind of need to do today instead of Thursday. So, but if there's people who want to join in, because we will start, I'll probably do one more of these before we get into like a systematic kind of workings through the book, just to see if any other people are interested, and then we can get like a pool of people, like a core group of people who want to just kind of plow through and engage in the material all the way through, because that's that'll take time to do that in a responsible way. Okay. All right, cool. Well, thank you guys for joining. I appreciate it. And let's also please try to engage in the Heart Shop group on Facebook. It'd be really helpful to kind of create some vibrant dialogue there and get more people seeing that stuff too. Because the more people that are interested, I want to. If people are interested, I want them to have access to everything. So that'd be fun to do that too. All right, guys. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.